Shut up and dribble. I mean, shut up and play with your test tubes? The science gets political again. Hillary Clinton comes out of the woodwork to say something absolutely wild, and another misgendering meltdown on TikTok. All this and so much more is coming up on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across the internet and across our politics from an independent perspective. If you're new here, please do consider subscribing and sticking around, and regardless, do hit that like button as we go along and do comment with your thoughts. I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Plus, if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely read it on tomorrow's show. So up first, we've got to talk about the science and the scientific institutions in America more broadly, because during the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, the politicization of the science led to a large-scale decrease in public trust for scientific institutions and scientists more broadly. But thankfully, it appears that people in scientific institutions have learned their lesson and are staying out of the political fray and showing less bias so they can regain that sense of objectivity. Just kidding. They're doing the opposite. One of the biggest scientific publications in America with a very long history, Scientific American, just came out and formally endorsed as a publication Kamala Harris for president. In an article entitled, "Vote for Kamala to Support Science, Health, and the Environment," they write that Kamala Harris has plans to improve health, boost the economy, and mitigate climate change. But Donald Trump just has threats and a dangerous record. The editorial from this publication that normally focuses on science news and research goes on to cite gun control, abortion, and even tax policy as reasons that Americans should supposedly support Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. What any of that has to do with science or the actual publication's mission of informing Americans about science, your guess is as good as mine, folks. Your guess is absolutely as good as mine, because I'm coming up blank. And of course, these people who work at Scientific American have every right to vote for and who support whoever they please, but to do so while weaponizing the prestige and credibility of a scientific institution that has literally published the likes of Albert Einstein is another matter entirely. As the psychology professor Jeffrey Miller wrote on Twitter, it took Scientific American almost 2 centuries of dedicated, creative, principled effort by thousands of scientists, writers, and editorial staff to build up its reputation and credibility. The key thing to understand about the woke leftist takeover of formerly scientific institutions like Scientific American is that the new editors and staff are happy to throw away every ounce of that credibility if it can buy them even a tiny sliver of transient advantage in a political election. And I think that what Jeffrey hints at here, this idea that these institutions have been captured by a new generation of ideologues who actually do prioritize political activism over scientific objectivity or public trust, is onto something. I do think that's what's happening, because something's quite different from the years gone by. If you take a look at Scientific American's About page, where they describe their own mission, Scientific American covers the most important and exciting research, ideas, and knowledge in science, health, technology, the environment, and society. It is committed to sharing trustworthy knowledge, enhancing our understanding of the world, and advancing social justice. Huh? What about that last one? So there's quite something new there, right? It's not about pursuing truth or sharing knowledge. It's about promoting an agenda. Social justice is a particular agenda. And for something that's supposed to be science or truth-based, it actually cannot simultaneously be that you are promoting truth and knowledge and also a particular agenda. Because in real life, there will be times where that agenda and the truth or facts conflict, right? So maybe it's a controversial subject where research data about a certain group or about a certain statistic comes out that, is an ugly truth that cuts against social justice. Maybe it is this idea that police shootings are far less common than everyone thinks. Well, the data show that, but it's at odds with the social justice movement and their push for police brutality reform and police and criminal justice reform. It's like, you can't, at some point, you do have to choose between an agenda and the truth. And I think if we're being honest, they have made their choice. and it's becoming very clear. As the evolutionary biologist Colin Wright wrote on Twitter, if Scientific American truly cared about science, they'd know that political endorsements by ostensibly scientific publications do not affect people's views of political candidates and actually undermine public confidence not just in those publications, but in science as a whole. And Colin wasn't speculating here when he said that these kinds of endorsements do nothing to affect elections or people's perception of the candidates, but just destroy the objectivity and reputation of these scientific institutions. This is actually something we know to be true as a matter of fact, because back in 2020, another scientific journal, Nature, did something similar where its editors came out and endorsed Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And there were actually studies done on the impact this endorsement had on people and whether it changed their views. And the findings of some of those studies were incredibly damning. So one study that looked at the political endorsement by Nature and the trust in scientific expertise during COVID-19, it found that the endorsement from Nature had a statistically insignificant impact on Biden voters, and that more broadly, very little evidence showed that there was any real impact of the endorsement on how anyone viewed Biden or Trump. However, the endorsement did make Trump supporters much less trusting in the actual magazine itself, in Nature, but also of scientific institutions and scientists more broadly. So much so that they were then less interested in receiving information about vaccine efficacy from Nature as a publication. So it literally accomplished nothing in terms of swaying public opinion or changing the perception of the candidates, and just immolated their own credibility and reputation. Now, we've had the data from this study since 2023, but Scientific American is still choosing to do this. In doing so, they're accomplishing absolutely nothing except raw, unadulterated virtue signaling. But what they're doing that is at the expense of actual scientists and their reputation, which is to some extent unfair because these publications are more science adjacent. They're not typically actually run by literal scientists, but they do publish scientists in their articles and amplify their research. So they're kind of adjacent to the scientific institutions and the field, but scientists themselves aren't really making these decisions. These are journalists who cover science. So it's a little unfair on the actual scientists to get lumped in like this, but it just is the way that people's minds work. This is how public perception works, whether you like it or not. And they should know that. They should know that when they do this kind of thing, when they engage in such partisan and tribal behavior and then try to go back to being objective and covering science news, no one's going to buy it, first of all. No one's particularly interested in your thoughts on tax policy because you know nothing about that more than Adam or Eve on the street. And so all you're doing is harm and literally accomplishing nothing except getting maybe pats on the back from other woke journalists in the media, but you're doing it at the expense of the credibility of real science and real scientists. And if you ask me, it's an absolute disgrace. And when their readership and their legitimacy continues to decline, the folks at Scientific American will have no one, and I mean no one, except themselves to blame. But what do you guys think? Do you want scientific institutions wading further into politics, or do they need to get back in their lane? Let me know in the comments below, and do hit that like button while you're at it. Up next, Hillary Clinton warns that Americans who spread propaganda should be imprisoned. Coming up after a break. So now we got to talk about Hillary Clinton, who has popped out of the woodwork and come back onto the scene because we all missed her so much. We all missed hearing from sweet, delightful old Hillary. And she came on MSNBC for a wide-ranging interview with Rachel Maddow, where she suggested that Americans who spread propaganda or Russian talking points should face some form of legal sanction, either civil or even criminal, which would suggest imprisonment. You don't have to take my word for it. Here it is, straight from Hillary's mouth.
Republicans go to the floor of the Congress and they parrot Russian talking points. So I think it's important to indict the Russians, just as Mueller indicted a lot of Russians who were engaged in direct election interference and boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence, because the Russians are unlikely, except in a very few cases, to ever stand trial in the United States. They're not going to be going to a country where they can be extradited or even returning to the United States unless they are very foolish. So I think we need to uncover all of the connections and make it very clear that you could vote however you want. But we are not going to let adversaries, whether it is Russia, China, Iran, or anybody else, basically try to influence Americans as to how we should vote in picking our leaders.
So I have a lot to say about this. I struggle to even know where to begin. But first, there's really no denying one basic point, which is that Hillary Clinton still seems incredibly bitter and salty over losing in 2016. And she still seems to be clinging to this farcical notion that the reason she lost was because of memes that Russian bots spread on Facebook, when in reality that had very minimal impact. And Hillary, you lost because of you, because of your bad campaign tactics, neglecting states like Michigan, because of your baggage that could fill an entire carousel at the airport, because of your unlikable nature and your attempt to flip-flop and be all things to all people, and just so many other problems that ultimately come back to you. But she really does seem to be in denial and to be coping and trying to still tell herself that it was all because of Russia, Russia this, Russia that. Obviously, they did try to meddle in the 2016 election, but they were largely ineffective, and they spread cringe memes to boomers on Facebook. When you look at the numbers, they sound big, but when you actually look at them in the context of social media, they're an absolute drop in the ocean and had very little impact at all. So it's all a bunch of cope. It's pathetic that almost a decade later, she's still out here this salty and this in denial about her own role in her defeat. But it is what it is, and I guess I can't say I'm shocked. What's more, it's not really shocking to me, but what's more disturbing to me is the authoritarian impulse that Hillary Clinton still clearly has, where she suggests that people who repeat or argue propaganda or Russian talking points should face legal sanction, either civil or criminal. That is totally inconsistent with free speech. That's totally inconsistent with our First Amendment, which absolutely protects the right to say information or arguments that are false or that some might consider propaganda, or even to advocate for things that are in line with the viewpoint of the Russian government. All of that is protected by the First Amendment, which means none of it can be subjected to civil or criminal penalties in the kind of way she clearly has in mind. Obviously, it's a little bit different if people are working directly with the Russian government, but that becomes not about speech. People are allowed to have whatever opinions they want, even if those opinions align with Vladimir Putin on something like Ukraine, or if they really oppose Zelensky, or if they think the Ukraine government's really corrupt, or they don't want to fund Ukraine, or any of that. Those are their opinions, babe, and they're allowed to have them in a free country. The fact that you want to sanction people legally for that is dystopian and disturbing, and hilariously ironic on multiple levels, coming from Hillary Clinton of all people. To hear Hillary Clinton, of all people, who spent most of her career supporting U.S. attempts at regime change in other countries, act like it is such a unique horror that other countries would try to influence our elections is just hilarious. I mean, the call is coming from inside the house, babe. I agree that I don't want the Russian government influencing our election, but you have literally toppled governments and replaced them with US puppets in other countries. So I don't know that you're on the strongest ground to be making that argument, Hillary. And in the same way, Hillary Clinton, like most politicians, has lied about many things over the years and spread many false arguments that could be labeled propaganda. I mean, she lied over and over. Even the liberal-leaning fact checkers at PolitiFact, at the Washington Post have pointed this out. She lied over and over about classified information on her laptop in that whole scandal over her emails. That could easily be described as propaganda, blatant lies in pursuit of a political agenda. Should she be prosecuted for it? Should she face civil penalties for it? Of course, I don't think so. Now, I mean, maybe the underlying criminal activity of mishandling classified information, but not just lying to the public and saying things that aren't true as a politician. I don't support criminalizing that, but apparently she does. And gosh, I just wish these people would think 5 steps ahead. Do you really want a future President Trump potentially, or if not that, then another Republican in the future, to have the power to criminalize propaganda? How is that going to work out for the network you're speaking on? MSNBC, which puts out a lot of what its critics would call propaganda, attacking Republicans and simping for Democrats. Now, I support their right to do that unobstructed, but if you don't, you're kidding yourself if you think that's only going to be used one way, or that's only going to be used to target Republicans or Fox News or whatever. That's never how this works out. To me, this clip just showed that Hillary Clinton hasn't changed, and she hasn't learned any lessons from the many mistakes and pitfalls of her pathetic political career. What do you guys think? Are you happy that we still get to hear from Hillary from time to time? Let me know in the comments below. And now it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my segment where I take on the craziest ideas from the Clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slug slugs.
Today, this TikToker is very upset about being called sir in public despite having a full beard. Let's hear Caesar out, I guess.
So I got served today at the pharmacy, and I'm not saying men can't look like this, because please go off, kings, but like, I'm not doing damage to masculinity. I think y'all are when you sir me, when you call me a man, right? Like, I'm not a man. Don't consider me for the pool of men. And maybe the people who are like, oh, masculinity is in decline, well, stop thinking I'm doing anything with it. I'm not part of that equation. Count me out.
So maybe I'm just a cynic, or just heartless, or just not a nice guy, but I find myself unable to have even an ounce of sympathy for someone who goes out in public with a full beard, a male who goes out in public with a full beard, and then is upset at being called sir. What did you expect? I see that this person has breast implants, so they're sending mixed messages, but maybe they didn't take a look at your body. They just saw your male face with a full beard and called you sir. To me, that is not a hate crime. That is not an outrage. That is not even a mistake. Now, if you said, please don't call me sir, I think a service person should be polite and maybe just call you something else or avoid the issue. But to go out with this expectation or this entitlement that you can walk through the world fully appearing, at least shoulders up, as a male and as a man, and then not be called sir or viewed to be a man, just strikes me as totally unreasonable. And the whole thing, this obsession with how you're perceived by others or validated or not validated by others, is incredibly narcissistic. I mean, I support all day this person's right to dress however they please, to look, mix and match the different gender associations of the things about how they present themselves. It's a free country. Do what you will, but you can't do these things and then act like you're victimized when people make completely understandable assumptions about you. Now, in fairness, this person didn't really freak out the way that many of the TikTokers do upon being misgendered, but they do seem perplexed or confused by it, as if it's some sort of mystery or like doesn't make sense. It actually makes perfect sense. 99.99% of people just use pronouns that correspond with their biological sex. And in the cases where people don't, you're going to have to ask for that and hope that people choose to accommodate it, or at least present if you're wanting to be called ma'am or she or her, you're going to have to at least make some effort to present that way for any everyday person to even consider calling you that. And if you make no such effort whatsoever, or in fact, as you appear to do, seem to actively attempt to mix and match parts of both genders to make yourself unclear or ambiguous, although I don't really think it was successful, but because I do think this person is unambiguously male appearing. But if that's what you're going to do, you can't then complain when people still call you sir. I mean, they're just being polite. They're just doing their job. So there's not much to get up in arms here about from the perspective of this individual. And just more broadly, I'm really sick of seeing these videos on TikTok and other places on the internet where people aren't called what they like to be called, and then they come on the internet and complain about it. Like, don't you have any real problems? Don't you have actual things going wrong? If this is the biggest problem in your day today, you must have a pretty good life, is all I'll say. Like, you actually, to speak of privilege, as people on the left love to do, you actually must be pretty privileged if that's like an issue for you or something you feel the need to vent about or seek feedback about, because it's not that big a deal. some random person who's serving you somewhere calls you sir or ma'am or whatever. I mean, if I called someone on the phone and they referred to me as ma'am, for example, because say my voice sounded high on the phone or whatever, I wouldn't care. I'd just be like, yeah, sure. And if I felt some need to correct them because I was ordering like men's clothes or something where it was relevant, I would probably do so. But regardless, like some random person's word choice doesn't really meaningfully affect me. And that's where I think a lot of the pronoun people just kind of go astray, is that they need to focus on having a sense of self that's strong enough to not constantly be needing external validation and not need to be desperate for the rest of the world to validate you. Like if you're actually confident in your own sense of self, you don't need that. You don't really care. As long as people aren't actively harming you, their opinions are not super relevant to you. But when you care so much about what other people say and what other people think, right down to minute word choice like this, it actually isn't a great sign from your own perspective. And I have to say that people who are intentionally gender confusing, going out into the world and then making unreasonable demands of people is not a good look for the LGBT community or for actual transsexual people who want to blend in and want to just be accepted and be left alone. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. It's the kind of thing that strikes a lot of people as unreasonable, and then they associate it with the whole LGBT community. And it's a small piece of everything that I think is bringing down this movement and this community, though it's not really a community. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and do hit that like button because this one did try my patience a little bit. It really did. And now I'll wrap up today's show by reading a few of your comments from the last episode. One person says, I enjoy 100% of what you present, agree with 80%, and love disagreeing respectfully about the other 20%. Thanks, Brad. Oh, that's perfect. That's a great attitude to have. Now, I also have to say the issue is not that Kamala's interview is edited. Every 4 broadcast piece is edited for brevity, accuracy, and clarity, and they weren't trying to hide it. It was available. I want the media to get to the point. I don't have all day. Save me the BS and act as the fourth estate you're meant to so I can be educated enough to ask the right questions and make decisions. The real issue is what you also said, that Trump or any political candidate for that matter should be afforded the same. Well, I think we all know they wouldn't be, and that's part of the issue I have with this. And I do agree that all interviews that are aired on TV do have to be edited for brevity or clarity, but I don't think it should be done in a way that like substantively changes what the answer is. And that's the issue that I had with this one. Another person says, paying reparations at this point is similar to someone's great-grandfather was a serial killer, so you have to go to jail to finish his 125-year sentence. I mean, yeah, kind of, except in this case, we're also putting people in jail who don't even have a grandfather who was a serial killer, but just look like the grandfather of someone else, right? Like they have common race or DNA or ethnicity. It's not even your grandfather who did it necessarily. The whole thing is absurd to me. Another person says, hey, Brad, love your content, and I listen pretty frequently. I used to be pretty hardline right-wing, and I listened to Ben Shapiro pretty regularly. However, I was on active duty in the Air Force for 10 years, and I moved a lot. Throughout this time, I met a lot of people, saw a lot of different perspectives, and I've definitely moved to the center of the political spectrum, though I'll probably always lean right. I really appreciate your insight on things, and while I still respect Ben Shapiro, I think you've essentially replaced him for me. Keep up the good work. It's so interesting that you throw Ben Shapiro out there as a name, because I have very different views from him on a whole host of things, but I do kind of like his business model of being, this massively influential infotainer, writing books, doing podcasts, YouTube, social media star. And I think that's where I'd like to be one day, that level of influence, but using it to promote my own ideas and worldview, which are markedly different from Ben in some important ways. Another person says, when I hear someone say that capitalism is modern slavery, I cannot have any conversation with them. We just do not occupy the same reality. In order to have a conversation, both people need to have at least some common understanding of reality as it pertains to the topic. Someone who says capitalism is modern slavery is just too disconnected from reality to understand any argument to the contrary. I totally understand this point and why you would feel that way. I would be willing to have a conversation with somebody because I think I could maybe not make them see the light, but I think I could expose to the audience what an absurd perspective it is and maybe get some people on the fence or who haven't thought about it deeply to see why they should not believe this absurd notion. So I would be willing to do it, but I can understand your reluctance. I really can. Another person says the morally insane fallacy at the heart of identity politics is that a person can owe a debt for something someone else has done or be owed a debt for something that happened to someone else. That's a great way of putting it, and I completely agree. I reject the idea of collective guilt applied in any context, in any scenario. Another person says, as a person who is fourth generation removed from slavery and can and have traced my lineage to my grandmother's grandmother, long story, who was a slave, I'm fully against reparations. It's just another version of pandering that is absolutely unnecessary. It undermines the work that women and men like my grandmother's grandmother, Frederick Douglass, and others who put in the work to move away from that life. Others may not have been able to, but it's still wrong. Yeah, I agree. And I don't think, look, I get it, that it's not easy for everyone and people have it tough out there, but I don't think we can reach hundreds of years into the past and try to remake society to address historical wrongs without committing modern day injustices. Another person says, you can't put your 2 weeks as a slave, babe. And I think slaves would have been grateful for Taco Bell. Are two wild sentences, but agreed. This life we live may suck sometimes, but I'm also so thankful to have the ability to work and get compensation. Apologies if I misquoted, but it made me stop dead in my tracks. I'm just reminded how privileged we are because there are just so many things taken for granted and people want to blame the system. I am no one's victim. You didn't misquote me. I did say both of those things, and I do admit that stripped of their context, they're pretty wild sentences, but I stand by them. You cannot, in fact, put in your 2 weeks notice as a slave. So the idea that capitalism is slavery is absurd. All right, everybody, that is it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button and do comment with your thoughts before you go. I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. If you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely read it on tomorrow's show. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.